Okay, so I am in a media literacy class at college during summer, and I am so excited because we are going to have an entire class about video games. And that's never happened to me before, and I love video games. And I've made it clear to the whole class that I love video games, and I just, it's awesome. And then I get there, and class starts, and we watch a video called Game Over: Gender, Race, and Violence in Video Games. I was disappointed by the fact that it only focused on really violent video games and not the kinds that I would play. It did, however, highlight a lot of serious problems that are involved in the gaming industry. I have a link to the transcription of their video in the description of my video. You can click on it below. They also said at one point that video games are made by white guys and propagate white male perspectives and ideals. Which is totally true. It's just kind of funny because they showed a clip of a Metal Gear Solid video game as they said this, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is definitely a Japanese video game. It was not made by a white American or European director. It was made by a Japanese director. So the factual errors and the narrow examples not only painted a very inaccurate picture of gaming culture to non-gamers, but it also made it very hard for anyone who loves video games to take this video very seriously. And which is a problem too, because I actually agree with a lot of the points that this video makes. It makes a lot of very intelligent points by people who have backgrounds in psychology and in the military and stuff like that. But, anyway, I'm going to start out this whole mess using media literacy, which is what my whole class is about, and it's actually been teaching me media literacy skills very well. So, let's open up our media literacy toolkit. Here is the textbook that I use in media literacy. It's by W. James Potter, edition 6, Media Literacy. And I actually highly recommend this book, and it actually has a really great chapter about video games in it that I like a lot. So, let's open up this book and find out what Potter means by media literacy. Media literacy is a set of perspectives that we actively use to expose ourselves to the mass media to interpret the meaning of the messages that we encounter. Basically, we think about what we are reading or watching or playing as we are, participating in it, and then we analyze it afterward, and we figure out what it really means, and if there's any underlying messages that we might have glossed over, or if we come up with any special realizations about it as we think about it, stuff like that. And the three foundations, he says, that media literacy is based off of is deduction, synthesis, and abstracting. Deduction is using stuff that generally happens and uses to explain specific situations. Deduction can be a little bit scary because it can lead to stereotyping people, but it is also a practical part of life. For example, I will not expect to see a flying pig in real life because I have never seen one that can fly. Synthesizing is taking what is in the media or the information as a whole, breaking it down into little pieces and sorting it into groups like useful, not useful, offensive, or I respect that, and recognizing patterns or tropes and stuff like that. It largely determines what you remember from that media later on. Abstracting is kind of like summarizing. It means you're putting the message into your own words, and as few words as possible to get this big picture of what the media was telling you. Now I'll use my media literacy toolkit on the video Game Over: Gender, Race, and Violence in Video Games, and on my own gaming experience and my research online. I'm abstracting the video into two statements. The first one being that video games are conditioning me to kill people, or at least are involved in that, or can be involved in that. The second statement I'll get to later, but I'm going to turn this statement into a question that I now have to answer. I synthesize the video into useful information and not useful information. The useful information includes the fact that they use footage from only the most violent video games, The fact that this video is 10 years old and that a former Navy trainer of new recruits is giving his testimony about using video games like Doom and his own more specialized virtual games for making it easier for soldiers to shoot at human beings.
Difficult for a human being to kill a member of their own species. They have to be manipulated into it. And when you look deeper into the battle, you'll see that the history of warfare is ever more successful mechanisms to manipulate people into killing. Understand that Doom all by itself, even used with a keyboard, is good enough that the Marine Corps uses it to script killing in their soldiers. It provides the script, the rehearsal, the act of killing. Now, we have to understand that the military around the world and law enforcement organizations around the world do not use these killing simulators and spend billions of dollars on these simulators for fun. They do it because it works. It is their job to condition and enable people to kill. They know what they're doing.
I am generalizing the video's sources as being concerned activists who have extensive backgrounds in psychology and the military and related fields. Now, let's compare the information and contrast it to what I know from other sources. I do not play video games in which I shoot people. I don't like it. Plenty of gamers don't. I have not played any single game that film used as an example of video games in general. I usually play games in which I'm using swords or magic to non-graphically beat up imaginary monsters. But does it matter what game I play? I would say yes and no. While a more violent and graphic game can more easily lend itself to indulging in feelings or thoughts of venomous aggression, what matters is your attitudes going into, during, and after the game, not as much the game itself. When I play a game, my internal monologue is like this. But it is never like this. Die, 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 die. Okay, I couldn't imitate that seriously. But I've met people who think like that during a game. Ask yourself, are you getting adrenaline from surviving in the game? Or from killing in the game, or from something else, or enjoyment from the game from something else. It's just, you really need to pay close attention to your own feelings and thoughts when you're gaming. There is a lot of research that has gone into trying to link video games to violence, probably starting with the Columbine mass shooting. And it's a really complicated story, honestly. Like, a lot of people thought that the fact that they played violent video games had a lot to do with their activities at first. But then later on, 10 years later, everyone's looking back at it again, and people are saying more so that these two guys here, yes, they played violent video games, but they had very deep psychological problems that are way more complicated than just what media they are using. They simply aren't like ordinary kids who were bullied into retaliation, according to the psychologist Peter Langman. And they're not ordinary kids who play too many video games. They're not ordinary kids who want to be famous. They're simply not ordinary kids. These are kids with serious psychological problems. Also, How Stuff Works has a really great article too about violent video games and real-life violence and any connections there may be. They cite a lot of research, including these two studies here in the bullet points, talking about how various parts of the brain responsible for aggression respond when kids are playing these aggressive video games. There is even a difference in physical arousal between a bloody version of Mortal Kombat and a version of The Blood Turned Off. However, the article goes on to say that there is a lot more factors involved in violent behavior than just simply what media they use. In a person's life, there is a whole lifetime's worth of factors into the actions that they do at any given time. If you want to read these articles, I highly recommend them. Julia Layton for How Stuff Works wrote Do Violent Video Games Lead to Real Life Violence? And Greg Topo for USA Today wrote 10 Years Later, The Real Story Behind Columbine. Truth is that games can be used to indulge in dark emotions or to heighten healthy emotions, just like any other media. Only in the case of video games, it's especially personal because you participate in the action. So let's take our next big picture statement from this video. Video games are made by white guys and propagating the ideals and perspectives of white guys. Let's turn that into a question. Are video games made by white guys and propagating the ideals and perspectives of white guys? As mentioned in the beginning of my spiel, of course a huge number of video games are simply not created by white males. There are plenty of games that are created by white males, such as Halo, but there are at least just as many that aren't. But the characters, whether they're made in Japan or in America, are overwhelmingly white and male. Why is this? Why don't Japanese characters look more Japanese? I found a quote from Keiichiro Toyama, director of the famous horror video game series Silent Hill, about how he was afraid to make a main character too Japanese. He was discussing a new game in development called Gravity Rush and said, "The main character was the most difficult thing to lock down, so we thought a lot about it. If we made something completely Japanese, then it would only be acceptable to Japanese users, and we'll lose audience in other territories. So we avoided that." He ended up with a female character meant to seem exotic and powerful who was also of vaguely white ethnicity and appearance. Her name is Kat, which is easy for English speakers to say. So we see that white or vaguely white is good for international sales. This has its own set of troubling implications which are far more complicated than the Game Over video described. But do they carry over the white male ideals and perspectives which Game Over basically described to be racist and sexist in a white way? I would argue personally that these apparently white male characters do not carry over white male ideals and perspectives, at least not exclusively. At least more often than not, Japanese video game characters retain Japanese characteristics, traditions, knowledge structures, cultural background, and more. For example, in The World Ends With You, the characters are eating udon noodles alongside hamburgers and talk about monuments in Tokyo. So, my questions are answered, for now. I hope you enjoyed this video and encouraged you to be more thoughtful about how to use media. Media literacy and the tools of deduction, synthesis, and abstraction can be used in every situation. Media takes up so much time in our lives, it might as well be intentional. I hope to keep pursuing answers to questions as long as I can. I'm out of words to say, so bye!